Okay, this is a lecture on chapter 2 in General Psych. And there are 5 ways we gather information psychologically. One, we don't really talk about, even though it's your CTW for chapter 2, is anecdotal evidence. Anecdotal evidence is basically one person's opinion. You ask the person about stuff. Like we're interviewing, the few people left from World War II and asking them, how was, what their experiences were. The problem with anecdotal evidence is it's one person's opinion. So if you ask a Republican about Trump, you'll get one thing. If you ask a Democrat about Trump, you'll get another. So anecdotal evidence has got to be taken for what it is one person's opinion. So we really try to stay away from anecdotal evidence. Now the other 4 are we use quite often. Case studies is a bunch of anecdotal evidence. Case studies is gathering as much information as possible about the event. So if somebody's rioting, things are taking place, or something, if somebody gets shot or killed, then you have to interview all the people you can, watch all the video, all kinds of things like that. So a case study is basically a bunch of anecdotal evidences. The problem with case study is it's hard to generalize. It explains that event. So if a bridge collapse, it's because this or this, but it's really hard to, or like an airplane crash, they can find out the reason why, but it's hard to generalize for the future. And we know psychology, that's the essence of psychology, able to predict behavior. The second is surveys. We got polls going, it's election year, so every day a new poll comes out. And a survey is you just ask people, what they think. You get a large number. A third is naturalistic observation. This is like with Jane Goodall with the gorillas, where you just observe behavior and record it. You don't affect it in any way. And the fifth is probably the best, the experiment. An experiment is the best because you get to control variables. So we have a more exact information and data because we're controlling the certain variables. Talking about variables, now one thing I'd say about experiment is even though you may have a perfect correlation, which is a +1 or -1, you can never assume causation. You can assume causation, but you can't prove causation. So you can never prove causation through an experiment. Now let's look at, we talked about control variables and controlling variables. Well, we have 3 variables in an experiment. We have an independent variable, and that is the variable that's being studied, the variable that's being controlled by the experimenter, and is independent from the subject. The subject has no control over it. The second is the dependent variable, and that is dependent on the subject. It's the outcome. It's whatever the subject does. And so if we were saying whether alcohol affects aggression, the alcohol is something that the experimenter controls. You get this much, this gets person. Aggression is dependent on the subject. Now we have a control variable, and we need control variables to take those out of the equation. A control variable is a variable that all groups get. So if I was doing something, this pill helps you think better, then I got to make sure that you can't blame it on sleep, you can't blame it on diet, you can't blame it on stress. So I got to take all those variables out. So I control those. So then I can say this pill works. So independent, controlled by the subject. Independent, controlled by the experimenter. Dependent, controlled by the subject. Control variable, all parties get the control variable so we can take it out of the equation. For instance, I mentioned in class about if Florida orange juice helps prevent colds, we got to take a lot of things out of that to indicate orange juice. We got to take sleep, diet, stress, exercise, all that kind of stuff out of the equation. So everybody hopefully gets the same amount so we can point to whether or not orange juice works. We have two main problems with running an experiment. Excuse me a second here. One is experimental bias, and we hope this is unconsciously because we wouldn't think psychologists are honest people. But experimental bias is when the experimenter sets up this experiment to come out the way he or she wants it to come out. And so, I mean, if you trying to say this pill makes you lose weight and people gain weight, you throw them out of the study, so you just have the good data that you want in there. So experimental bias is the experimenter tries to manipulate the experiment to come out the way he or she wants. Subject bias is where the subject thinks they know what the experimenter wants and does what the experimenter wants, whether or not that is the case. So, if you're taking a taste test between Coke and Pepsi, and you can tell the people are behind the scenes are all Coke people, you're going to say Coke is better because you want to. That's what you want them to. You're trying to get them to try to help them out in the experiment. Now we also have what we call a control group. Don't get confused with control variable. Control group is the group of subjects who do not get the independent variable. They do not get the independent variable. The control group is set to get a base rate so we can compare. For instance, in the vaccine for COVID-19, Oxford University's got 30,000 people, and 15,000 are going to placebo, a control group, because they're not getting the vaccine. Other 15,000 are getting the vaccine. All 30,000 will be inoculated with COVID-19. And if the vaccine has less people getting COVID-19 than the base rate, we can say it works. Now, one of the things we can do is we can have a single blind study or a double blind study. And these two are the things to eliminate experimental bias or subject bias. For instance, a single blind study is either the subjects have no idea what the experiment's about, or the experimenter doesn't know who's in what group, because that's done by an outside person. A double blind is the best, and that's when the subjects don't know what the study's about until after it's over, and the experimenter doesn't know what's in their group. For instance, because placebo effect plays a major part in the experiment. Placebo effect means bogus treatment. And it appears to be genuine, but it's not. They have given sugar pills to people and told them it'll make them smarter, it'll make them happier, it'll make them healthier, it'll make them sleep, it'll make them dream, it'll make them sexier, all this kind of stuff. And the power expectation, people believe it. I told in class about a Ohio State student who told people that the Ohio State Cognitive Psych Department invented a smart pill, and it was basically a fish oil, and people took it. Actual grades went up, even though the pill had nothing to do with that. It's a power expectation. So that's why you need a single and double blind studies to contemplate that. Now this is going to sound weird, but a theory is not a theory, even though it's a theory, until it's replicated. You go, what the hell are you talking about doing? You know what I'm saying is, because you have a theory and you run an experiment and you hope, there it is, I'm right. In psychology, we do not consider it right until somebody else, not affiliated with you, does the experiment. And if they get the same results you do, you now have a theory. So it's a theory's got to be replicated before it's a theory. This is why we have an operational definition. An operational definition is it's a recipe for the study. So somebody else can run it exactly the way you do. That's why you have a recipe for food, right? So it tastes the same way as the chef who invented the meal tastes like. And so, if you say Coke is better than Pepsi, you got to define what better is. That's part of the operational definition. So an operational definition is a recipe for the study. Now, uh, we cannot test the whole population. It's too expensive. It's too many. So if I was going to do a study on college students, I can't test every college student in the world, the universe, even on Mars. We have universities there. So a population is the total number of people, subjects that you're talking about. What we do is a sample, which is a portion of the population. And the problem is getting the right sample. This is election year, and in November 3rd, they'll be predicting results of elections of states. This person's won, this person's lost. Within minutes of the polls closing, even though they have less than 1% of the vote. If you get a good enough sample across the population, then you can predict what's happening. For like TV, the Nielsen only test 1,500 homes, and they determine what you watch because they have a really good sample. However, if the sample is totally wrong, and then then we're going to generalize by mistake. So if I was going to do find out what all college students think about some issue, and I only interviewed some sorority, then that's a terrible sample because that doesn't represent the whole school. And so a sample, to be valuable, has to represent the total population. We have made so many overgeneralizations by using the incorrect samples. For instance, in the 2016 election, everybody thought Hillary Clinton won because they polled people who didn't vote. And so that's not the population we want. We want to sample actual voters. We have two types of studies. We have a laboratory study and a field study. A laboratory study is a controlled environment. A field study is naturalistic observation. So if you're watching sexual harassment in a office and you have hidden cameras, that would be a field study because you're observing a natural occurrence. A laboratory study can be done in a field. For instance, on the way to Columbia, the University of Missouri has 5 different types of corn. They're all getting the same amount of water, the same amount of fertilizer, same amount of sunshine, and we're going to see which corn grows best. That's in a field, but it's actually a lab study for controlling the environment. And the final thing is rights of subjects. This is ethics. And you cannot put a subject in psychological or physical harm. And so a lot of studies that we're going to study in our textbook, well, actually in Psych 2 more than Psych 1, we can't do anymore because they're unethical studies. Like the Milgram study about shocking people was unethical, so we couldn't do that anymore. And the other part of ethics is honesty. That's why we replicate. The old Reagan slogan, test but verify. So that's the reason why we replicate it, because sometimes some psychologists may not be telling the truth, so we replicate it to see. Hopefully this explains chapter 2. Have a good day.